In the dry dust of Paracas in 1928, Julio Tello brushed away sand from a burial chamber and found a line of skulls that did not look normal at first glance. More than 300 of them, pale in the sun, long and heavy in the hand. Some were reported with a cranial volume up to a quarter larger than typical human crania from the same period. That is where the story stops being a curiosity and starts becoming a problem. Because the official explanation is simple enough. Artificial cranial deformation, shaped in childhood by binding. But then the details begin to push back. A few specimens are said to show a single fused plate where two bones should meet. Others were described as unusually dense, almost weighty, in a way that made the old labels feel thin. And once that kind of report exists, it does not stay in the ground. It moves into museum drawers, catalog cards, and arguments that never really die. The Paracas material has sat in regional collections for decades, with only a handful of independently published tests. So the question is not just what they were shaped into, it is what they were before anyone tried to explain them away. If this kind of investigation pulls you in, like and subscribe to keep it going. That is where the burial ground itself starts to matter. Tello was not pulling odd bones from loose sand at random. He was opening a necropolis, wrapped bundles, woven cloth gone stiff with salt, dry earth packed around the dead like a seal. These skulls were part of a community, placed carefully, preserved with intention. And that changes the tone of the whole case, because a cemetery with hundreds of similar crania does not look like a string of accidents. The standard answer, artificial cranial deformation, is real. Ancient people in different parts of the world did shape infants' heads with bands, boards, and pressure while the bone was still soft. That much is not fantasy. But when anthropologists compare ordinary shaped skulls to some of the Paracas examples, the fit gets uncomfortable. External form can be altered, the angle can change, the crown can lengthen. Yet the lower structure, especially around the foramen magnum and the base of the skull, should still stay within recognizably human patterns. And that is where the file grows quiet. Because once a specimen seems to move from modified to structurally unusual, labels get cautious, drawers close, and photographs start doing more work than published measurements. Which raises the next problem. How many of these were simply shaped, and how many were something harder to classify? That question follows the collection out of the cemetery and into storage. After excavation, the remains did what important finds always do. They were cleaned, logged, boxed, and moved into institutions. Labels replaced sand. Handwritten notes replaced the wind off the peninsula. In museum records, a skull with an unsettling profile becomes a specimen number, a shelf location, a transfer date. And once that happens, the mystery changes shape. It becomes administrative. Some of these remains ended up in regional collections, including the Paracas History Museum in Ica. A few photographs circulated, a few measurements were repeated in books, talks, and small reports. But broad, independent testing never seemed to catch up with the claims. That gap matters, because if the official explanation is strong, it should survive modern scrutiny with no trouble at all. Instead, the pattern feels oddly familiar. Discovery, registration, transfer, then a long period where the material is still there, but harder to evaluate than it should be. Just dimmed. And in that dim light, one detail kept returning. The reports that certain skulls were not only elongated, but heavier, with cranial volume outside the expected range. Which means the next step is not shape, it is measurement. So the question became measurable. Once the remains were in collections, researchers started comparing the long skulls against ordinary human crania from the same period. That is where the story gets sharper, because shape alone is easy to hand-wave away. Weight is harder, so is cranial volume. And a few Paracas examples were reported to run up to 25% larger than expected, with a heavier feel that did not match the neat museum label beside them. The official explanation still points to artificial cranial deformation, and that does account for a lot, but it does not automatically settle every specimen in the set. If the base of the skull, the thickness, and the internal proportions shift together, then the question is no longer, was it shaped? It becomes, was it only shaped? That's why the measurements matter so much. A museum drawer can hide an odd outline. It cannot hide a pattern forever. And once a pattern starts showing up in repeated notes, old photographs, and half-published reports, the file starts pointing somewhere else, toward the one detail nobody seems eager to test again. That detail sits right at the edge of the argument. A long head can be explained. A flattened forehead can be explained. Even an extreme silhouette can still fit the practice of artificial cranial deformation. But once older descriptions start mentioning a single fused plate where two bones should meet, the tone changes. That goes beyond outward form. It reaches into the construction of the skull itself. Now, to be careful here, not every photo proves that claim. Not every label in a small collection is precise. Old notes can be sloppy, and museum light can turn a shallow line into a missing one. But the report survives for a reason. It was never cleanly settled. No broad modern study came in, checked the sutures one by one, published the scans, and closed the case. And that matters, because the official explanation works best when the anatomy under the surface stays ordinary. If a specimen has altered shape and altered structure, then it belongs in a different conversation. So by this point, the problem with these remains is not that they look strange. It is that the most disputed features seem to live in a narrow zone, visible enough to circulate, inaccessible enough to remain unresolved. Then, in 2014, the argument moved from bone to DNA. That is where the argument leaves the museum shelf and enters the lab. In 2014, a preliminary genetic pass on a few samples reportedly pointed to unusual mitochondrial mutations. That sounds dramatic, but the important part is what came after it. The result was disputed, never peer-reviewed, and never allowed to become a settled reference point. So the DNA widened the case. Because if the bones were only an example of artificial cranial deformation, the genetics should have folded neatly back into the known human range. Instead, the report sat there like a loose wire in the file, intriguing, incomplete, and impossible to treat as final proof of anything. The skulls remained human in the broad sense, but the paperwork around them stopped behaving like a normal collection. And that is what keeps happening with this material. A claim appears, gets logged, then stalls before independent replication can do its job. Not enough to prove a hidden history, but enough to keep the question alive. Which means the next fight is not over shape anymore. It is over what these remains are allowed to mean. And that is a much larger problem than it sounds. Once a collection stops being only physical evidence and starts becoming a contested symbol, every test around it gets heavier. A scan is not just a scan. A tissue sample is not just a sample. With these remains, each new examination seems to arrive carrying two shadows at once. One from mainstream archaeology, the other from fringe speculation. And somewhere between those two, the actual material sits in a drawer, dry and silent. That helps explain why so few independent studies seem to move cleanly from access to publication. Regional museums have reasons to be cautious. Small collections can be misquoted, overexposed, or turned into spectacle overnight. But caution creates its own pressure. Because when years pass and the data stays thin, the absence begins to speak louder than the evidence. This is where the Paracas case starts to feel less like an isolated anomaly and more like a pattern. Find, register, transfer. Then a long slowing down, where nothing is fully hidden, but very little is settled in public. Once that pattern becomes visible, the question shifts again. Maybe the issue is not only what these skulls are, but what kind of evidence is allowed to remain unresolved. So the DNA result mattered so much. In the 2014 pass, a few samples were said to carry unusual mitochondrial mutations, just a narrow window into the material that had already been made famous by shape, weight, and those older suture claims. The report never made it through peer review, and that alone changed how everyone handled it. In this field, a preliminary note can travel faster than a careful one, but it rarely survives contact with the next question. And here, the next question was obvious. If these remains were only the product of artificial cranial deformation, why did the genetic claim not settle back into ordinary human variation? Why did it instead leave behind more silence, more caution, more delays? That is the strange part. The skulls do not disappear. The argument does. A few lines in a lab memo become a rumor, then a dispute, then a file people mention only in passing. So the collection stays where it is, under glass and in storage, while the most important test remains half finished. And that is exactly where the pressure starts to build. So the comparison stage came next. Researchers did what they always do with contested material. They set the Paracas crania beside ordinary samples and started checking what matched and what did not. Shape was one thing, but once the focus moved to the base of the skull and the foramen magnum, the tidy story got harder to keep. Those lower structures are not where decoration happens. They are where development shows through. So the official explanation works only up to a point. Artificial cranial deformation can stretch, flatten, and narrow the top of the head. It does not automatically explain every heavy specimen or every report that the internal proportions looked off. And when one part of the skull stays within human range, while another seems to drift outside it, the whole case becomes less comfortable. Still, nothing about this collection is simple. Some pieces fit the old model, some do not. And the more carefully the records are compared, the more the set begins to look mixed, not neat. Which means the real question is not whether the skulls were shaped. It is who decided where the line between shaped and unknown should be drawn. So the comparison never feels clean. The official explanation can account for many of the skulls, but not all of the details people keep circling back to. Once a sample shows elongated shape, unusual weight, and a base that does not line up neatly with standard expectations, it stops behaving like a simple example of artificial cranial deformation. It becomes a mixed signal. And mixed signals are dangerous in this kind of file because they keep both sides arguing without ever forcing a final answer. The material still draws attention in quiet museum rooms and half-forgotten notes. Some pieces fit the old model, some do not. The collection is not one neat category. It is a spread of cases. And the spread itself is the problem. So the debate shifts again, away from shape and into authority. Who gets to say that a difficult specimen is solved? And who gets left with the one that still doesn't fit? Once that question is asked, the next name in the chain is not an archaeologist. It is a museum catalog. That is where the paper trail starts to matter. Once a specimen gets a catalog number, it stops being a rumor and becomes a record. But with the Paracas material, that record does not always stay stable. A note appears in one ledger, a measurement in another, and then a later inventory uses softer language, as if the same skull had quietly changed categories while nobody was looking. That is the kind of thing that turns a collection into a puzzle. The elongated Paracas skulls of coastal Peru have lived through that process for years. Found, logged, transferred, then described more cautiously in the next archive. Some entries still point to regional storage. Some references just vanish into old references and dead links. Not destroyed, not erased on paper, but weakened enough that outside researchers cannot build on them cleanly. And once a file gets that thin, the subject itself starts to blur, the history around it. Which is why the next question is awkward. Who gets to decide when a difficult record stays visible and when it quietly stops counting? That question becomes less dramatic and more unsettling the closer the records are examined. No secret chamber is required, no theatrical disappearance. With this material, the shift can happen through ordinary decisions, a cautious relabeling, a delayed request, a specimen marked too fragile for handling, a test proposed and then never fully followed through. Each step sounds reasonable on its own. Together, they leave the same result, a famous collection that remains strangely underanswered. And that is what makes these skulls such a stubborn case. The bones are still real. The museum cases are still real. The storage shelves are still real. What keeps thinning out is the bridge between the object and the published conclusion. Once that bridge weakens, the loudest voices rush in from both sides. Some insist the answer is already known. Others insist the unanswered details prove far more than the evidence can carry. The Paracas material gets trapped between those extremes, while the careful middle ground, the place where real science should live, stays oddly underbuilt. Which leads to a harder possibility. Maybe the danger here is not one strange collection, but what it reveals about how uncertainty is managed when a specimen refuses to behave. And that is where this stops being a museum mystery and starts touching the wider map of human history. If every unusual specimen in the Paracas collection can be folded back into the same old category, then the story stays small. A local custom, an extreme visual effect, a few exaggerated claims. But if even a narrow group of these remains turns out to be structurally distinct in ways that are not explained by binding alone, then the implications spread fast. Ancestry, migration, isolation, maybe even a population trait that current models have flattened into one convenient label. This is why the thinness of the published record matters so much. A difficult skull is not just a difficult skull. It is a pressure point. Once it resists the official explanation, it starts pressing against larger assumptions about who lived on that coast, how separate communities developed, and how many ancient variations were quietly merged after the fact. None of that requires fantasy. It only requires incompleteness. And incompleteness, when it sits for decades inside a famous collection, begins to look less like a temporary gap and more like a protected one. Which brings the whole case to the simplest and most uncomfortable question yet. If the answer is testable, why has nobody finished the test? That is why the next step should have been the easiest one. Modern testing exists for exactly this kind of case. Scans, measurements, material checks, clean comparison against ordinary human crania. If the elongated Paracas skulls of coastal Peru were only the result of artificial cranial deformation, then a transparent round of analysis should have settled the shape question fast. But the material does not move that cleanly. Access is limited, samples are small, and every request seems to run into another layer of caution. So the argument stays suspended because the bones are still there, and the record around them is thin enough to fight over. One side sees old custom and nothing more. The other sees a collection that keeps refusing simple closure. And that is where the tension sharpens again. The longer the case sits in partial view, the more it stops looking like a one-off museum oddity and starts looking like a test of who gets to control the story when the evidence will not stay quiet. This is why the debate keeps sliding upward, from bone to policy. If a specimen cannot be resolved cleanly, the question stops being only anatomical and becomes institutional. The elongated Paracas skulls of coastal Peru sit in that exact spot now, still cataloged, still referenced, still too incomplete to settle. And when that happens, the argument around them starts to look less like archaeology and more like a contest over which uncertainty gets to survive. The official explanation can still hold for many examples, but the mixed cases keep refusing to disappear, and that refusal matters. Because every time a difficult skull is pushed back into the same broad category, the pressure does not go away. It just moves into the margins, where the labels are softer and the records are harder to check. So the real issue is not shape alone. It is the handling of ambiguity. And when ambiguity is handled too carefully for too long, the question is obvious. What else in the file was made to look settled before anyone was allowed to finish looking? At this point, the dispute no longer lives only in the skulls themselves. It lives in the gap between what can be checked and what keeps getting deferred. The elongated Paracas skulls of coastal Peru still sit in storage and regional display cases, but the moment someone asks for a fresh pass, scans, thickness mapping, a clean comparison against standard human crania, the process slows. The official explanation can still absorb many examples. It cannot comfortably absorb every mixed specimen, especially when the base, weight, and proportions keep pulling in different directions. So the argument turns procedural. Who approves access? Who signs off on sampling? Who decides that one more delay is caution and the next delay is silence? That is the uncomfortable part here. Nothing needs to be destroyed for a record to become unusable. It only needs to be left incomplete long enough. And once that happens, the collection stops looking like a closed case and starts looking like something that was never meant to be finished in public. By now, the real fight is over what counts as enough. The elongated Paracas skulls of coastal Peru are still there, cataloged, still discussed in fragments, but the case around them has drifted into a familiar zone where access, caution, and delay all sound reasonable on their own. That is exactly why the material keeps slipping through the cracks. Nothing has to be hidden in a dramatic way. It only has to stay inconvenient. And that is the part that makes this collection so hard to dismiss. The official explanation can handle many skulls. It can even cover strong examples of artificial cranial deformation. What it cannot do as neatly is absorb every report of heavier bone, odd proportions, and a few specimens that never seem to fit the same box. So the question is not just anatomical, it is procedural, almost political. Who decides when a difficult specimen is settled, and who decides when it is quietly parked until nobody asks again? That is the real tension now, because if a case this famous can stay unresolved this long, then the next thing in the file may matter even more than the skulls themselves. In the end, the answer was not a single discovery. It was the way the same collection kept forcing the same question back into the light. The elongated Paracas skulls of coastal Peru never stopped being physical objects, but the story around them stayed half-finished, on purpose, or by habit, or by fear of being wrong too early. Some pieces fit the official explanation. Some pieces did not. And the ones that did not were always the ones with the heavier feel, the stranger base, the quieter labels. That is the lesson hiding inside the dust. A shelf can look calm and still hold an unresolved history. By evening, the museum room was empty again. The glass cases held only reflections, and the long shadows of the lids stretched across the floor like unanswered lines. Whoever gets to name the missing line gets to shape the past.